Hi everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're going to be reading in Chapter 9 from our textbook for this course, Jill Lepore's These Truths, because this textbook is the textbook that I use for both U.S. History 1 and 2. That's why we are starting at Chapter 9 for this course. Make sure before you read Chapter 9 that you have read the introduction to the textbook. It's going to provide some helpful information about how you should approach the textbook and think about some of the topics that are going to be covered in it. Before I get into previewing what you're going to see and read in Chapter 9, I want to talk just a little bit about the textbook itself and the textbook's format. To start with, I really would stress to not be intimidated by this textbook. The format of this textbook is different from a lot of traditional textbooks. It doesn't have the big splashy color images. It doesn't have a lot of the headers and margins and sort of organizational graphics that a lot of textbooks have. So you are going to see a lot of text on the pages, but don't let that intimidate you. This book can be quite manageable if you approach it in a focused and intentional way. And one of the ways that's helpful to approach this reading is to think about the structure of the chapters and what the different parts of the chapters that you're going to be reading covers. So I hope that this short lecture, which is going to provide a brief overview of what the different parts of Chapter 9 cover and what you might expect to see in Chapter 9, will help you to better understand what you're reading in Chapter 9 and to think about how best to approach this textbook. So when you start reading the first part of Chapter 9, you're going to be reading about Reconstruction. So this deals with developments, events, and programs just after the Civil War. And these are topics that actually come before the start of this course. U.S. History 2 is U.S. History from 1877. So you might be wondering why you're reading about events before 1877. But as I'll touch on a little bit more later on in this lecture, the events of Reconstruction are really important to understanding what's happening in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century, and particularly when we think about issues faced by African Americans and other issues of race in the United States during this time. It's really important to have a sense of what Reconstruction was about, what parts of Reconstruction succeeded, and what parts of Reconstruction failed in order to understand what's going on as far as a lot of these related topics during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second part of this chapter deals with the ongoing industrialization of the United States, what's sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution, in which you have electricity and steel and coal power that's driving and accelerating industrial development in the United States. And we're also going to see a populist movement that centers around the People's Party ultimately, and is primarily agrarian. It's primarily supported by farmers and rural people that is trying to respond to some of these problems created by the Second Industrial Revolution. The third part of this chapter is going to dive deeper into the political culture of this period, and that's something that's pretty important and pretty helpful because there certainly are commonalities between the politics of the late 19th century and politics today, but a lot of the culture of politics and some of the mechanics as well are important or are different in some pretty important and specific ways. So it's important to have a sense of that. You're also going to be reading more about the populist movement, the People's Party, and its impact on the two major political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, during this period of time that is often referred to as the Gilded Age. This was a term that Mark Twain, the writer, came up with. And what it refers to is the way in which a lot of things during this period might have looked good on the surface. There were extravagant displays of wealth, there were some very nice buildings and other pieces of infrastructure that were built during this period. But what the term gilded means is it means to coat something in gold. So, what it means is you have something that's coated in gold and it's shiny and pretty on the surface, but under that surface, it might not be quite so nice. And so that's what Twain is referring to here, and that's what this term refers to. That some things might look quite nice and shiny, but when you dig under the surface, there are a lot of social and economic problems that the country is facing during this late 19th century period. The last part of this chapter is going to look at some of the uh, most important examples of racial discrimination and oppression. You're going to be reading about Jim Crow, this network of discriminatory laws that established segregation and all other kinds of means of oppression of African Americans in the South. You're going to be reading about the Chinese Exclusion Act that was the first limit on immigration to the United States passed during the late 19th century. So we have a lot of different developments as far as discrimination and oppression against non-white peoples in the United States during this period. And so this comes back to what I mentioned earlier as far as the importance of the Reconstruction period, because you really want to think about how Reconstruction shapes a lot of these developments and debates that we see during the late 19th century. In the meantime, good luck with the reading. Please let me know if you have any questions about it, and good luck with all of the assignments that we have coming up during this week.